Thanks everyone for coming. My name's Ethan Coonan, and today I'm going to talk about some of the basic factors of trunk growth. This was my master's thesis research project, and it was motivated by an interest in uneven age management. And an important tool for management is a growth model. And for a good growth model, we need to have a solid understanding of the biological mechanisms that are driving growth. So Emily said it on Tuesday morning, and I'm going to say it again. Volume or mass increment of an individual tree continues to increase with greater size. Steve Stillett found this to be true in the world's tallest species, Coast Redwood and Eucalyptus regnans. And Stephenson reviewed 403 tree species around the world and found this to be true with the overwhelming majority of them. In addition to size, what we call above ground vigor explains a significant amount of variation in trunk growth. All living cells need carbon to respire and for building material, while leaves and other photosynthetic tissue fix carbon from the atmosphere. Therefore, the ratio of respiring tissue to photosynthetic tissue is a good measure of a tree's above ground vigor. In other words, a tree with less respiring tissue per unit leaf area will have relatively more carbon available for growth. And we call it above ground because we don't have any below ground data. And of course, light is important for growth, but it's logistically complicated to sample since the sun's position is constantly changing. Luckily, hemispherical photography can take an instantaneous sample and account for the annual and daily changes and light availability. But still, the enormous amount of effort that would be necessary to quantify the light environment of an individual tree explains why individual tree growth models instead quantify the neighboring trees to evaluate competition for light availability. So basal area, stand density index, and basal area larger are distant independent indices you may be familiar with. They don't incorporate the distance between the subject tree and its competitors. Crown closure 66, or crown cross-sectional area 66, is another distant independent indice that was developed for our Coast Redwood growth model 4C. On the other hand, distance can be included in the evaluation of competition. For example, you could use a horizontal angle, the same as a variable radius plot, or a vertical angle so that a neighboring tree's size and distance determines whether or not it's a competitor. Alternatively, the distance between a subject tree and its competitor can be incorporated into the formula used to quantify competition. And generally, these distant dependent indices outperform distant independent indices for species that live in highly variable light environments and have complex structure like redwood forest. So we had three main objectives for our research. The first was to assess the best metric of light availability for predicting trunk growth. The second was to quantify the amount of variation in trunk growth attributed to light availability after accounting for the effects of size and above ground vigor. And the third was to compare various competition indices for their ability to predict trunk growth. So if we selected trees from a single stand, it would confound the effects of size and light, simply because smaller trees are often in the shade. To avoid this, we selected 4 dominant and 4 subordinate trees from 3 different height classes, ranging between 20 meters in height and 70 meters in height. So half of the trees were dominant, half of the trees were subordinate. And we tried to minimize site quality effects by limiting the study to the western half of the range and not selecting trees that are on alluvial flats or xeric sites. So trees were accessed with rope climbing techniques. All trunks and branches were measured for position, size, and percent dead. 30 of the 2,480 young growth branches were removed and dissected to quantify the area, the volume, the mass of the bark, the cambium, the sapwood, the heartwood, and the leaves. And that data was combined with data from 34 other branches from concurrent research to build allometric equations for predicting these attributes. And then the equations were applied to the remaining branches. The 2 increment cores at 5 evenly spaced heights were collected to measure bark thickness, sapwood thickness, trunk age, and growth. And light availability was sampled at the periphery and the middle of the foliated radius of the crown along 4 vertical paths. And photos were analyzed with WINS canopy to quantify canopy openness, direct site factor, indirect site factor, and total site factor. And then the samples were averaged across the entire crown. I also broke the crown into thirds and took averages for each third, and also did a principal components analysis with light variables, since we had so many, to try and collapse them into a single variable. And 3 fixed area nested plots were installed around each tree to quantify competition. We computed basal area, stand density index, basal area larger, crown closure 66, which is the per acre sum of crown cross-sectional areas evaluated at 66% of the subject tree's height, and then divided by the number of square feet in an acre. And then also crown volume 66. We also used 2 distance-dependent indices. So we used a cone of influence, which is delineated by a 60-degree angle emanating from the subject tree's crown base. And any crown that was within this cone of influence was considered a competitor. The sum of crown volumes computed distance-dependent crown volume, and the sum of crown cross-sectional areas at the point of intersection computed distance-dependent crown area. So in the background are all the different cores I'd taken. We quantified growth in 3 ways. The main trunk wood volume in 2014 minus main trunk volume in 2011 divided by 3 gave us an average annual volume increment. We divide that volume increment by the cambium area, and we get a radial increment, which is what the radial growth would be if growth occurred evenly across the trunk. And we also use main trunk growth efficiency, which is defined as a mass increment divided by leaf mass. And these second 2 growth responses have an important size attribute in the denominator, which makes them independent of size. So we had a lot of structural variables. You can see 6 that related to size and 3 related to above ground vigor. So we did a principal components analysis to collapse the multicollinearity among these structural variables into scores for each tree. And we'll just go to the results of that principal components analysis. So all the size variables correlated strongly with principal component 1, and the above ground vigor variables correlated with principal component 2. And 95% of the variation in these structural variables was captured in these 2 principal components. So here's a lineup of the 24 trees in the study. These are the models I built from the data, and they're ranked by the first principal component, size. So the biggest tree had over 69 cubic meters of wood and bark, and the smallest tree had less than a cubic meter of wood and bark. The youngest tree was 20 years old, and the oldest tree was over 560 years old. We did a model selection process to answer the first objective, what's the best light availability metric. And on the left we have the R-squared of the various models. They were all the same except for their light availability term. And on the right is the AICC model weights, which is just a way to compare a set of models. And you can see a mid-crown openness was the most likely model for volume increment. For the radial increment model, mid-crown openness was second, but only slightly behind the variable derived from the principal components analysis for light, which was only 1.1 times more likely than the mid-crown openness. And then mid-crown openness was the most likely model for main trunk growth efficiency. So we took this as good evidence that mid-crown openness was our best light availability metric, and that openness is the percent of unobscured sky, and mid-crown openness is those values averaged across the middle third of the crown. So now we're looking at how the 3 growth responses are affected by size. And you can see volume increment is related to size. For example, the biggest tree over here grew the most wood annually, over a cubic meter. It's a lot of wood. And the smallest tree had the third smallest volume increment. Here's another example. So the smallest tree had similar above ground vigor and similar light availability as tree 21. But tree 21 was a lot bigger, and it grew 3/4 of a cubic meter more wood annually. So it would take 18 trees similar to tree 1 to grow as much wood as tree 21. We found out something else interesting about the size effect with coast redwood. For many species, radial increment starts to decline after a certain size. Even though our study included trees up to 191 centimeters in diameter, radial increment nor radial increment at breast height correlate with DBH. And here are the growth responses and how they're affected by above ground vigor. And note the R squared is the highest for the radial increment model. And here the trees are ranked by size on top and ranked by above ground vigor on the bottom. And there's 3D PDFs of each of these trees on the online publication. So if you're curious about these or you want to check them out closer, you're welcome to go online, and in the appendix there's a 3D PDF for each tree. And this paper was published in the Journal of Forest Ecology Management, December 2015 issue. There's a lot more interesting details in the paper and better explanation of the methods. An example of the above ground vigor effect. Tree 10 was slightly smaller and had less light availability than tree 11, but its above ground vigor was nearly twice that of tree 11, and it grew nearly twice as much wood. So here's how the three growth responses are affected by light availability. Notice there's a correlation among all three. Radial increment has the highest R squared. And even though our study included trees between 20 meters in height and 70 meters in height, light availability alone was able to explain half of the variation in growth. And part of that's because light availability and above ground vigor came out to be correlated. Trees that are stuck in the shade generally have less leaves per unit leaf area, cambium surface area. So tree 2 and tree 5, similar size, had similar above ground vigor, but tree 5 had 10% greater light availability and grew 4 times more wood and had 4.5 times greater radial increment. So coast redwood is often called a shade-tolerant species, and sure, it's tolerant of shade. We had a subordinate tree that was 560 years old. It's been sitting in the shade for over 560 years and it's still alive. But these trees sure do like light for growth. So here's 3 bar graphs for each of the growth responses, and each bar represents the decline in residual deviance with each additional variable. And this answers our second objective: how much variation in trunk growth can be explained with light availability after accounting for size and above ground vigor. 10% of the variation in volume increment, 15% of the variation in radial increment, and 18% of the variation in main trunk growth efficiency can be explained by light availability after accounting for size and above ground vigor. And our volume increment model had R squared of 0.89, which is pretty good. So we also did a model selection process for the competition indices. For the volume increment model, the distance dependent crown volume just blew all the other models out of the water. It was by far the best. And note that the competition index used in forestry, CC66, was ranked the least likely. And for the radial increment model, once again, CC66 was on the bottom. And the 2 distance dependent competition indices were on top. Now for the main trunk growth efficiency model, distance dependent crown volume was second, but only to basal area larger. And the high ranking of basal area larger and basal area indicate that main trunk growth efficiency is likely as responsive to below ground competition as it is to above ground competition. So in conclusion, canopy openness averaged across the middle of the crown was our best light availability metric for predicting trunk growth. By quantifying tree size, above ground vigor, light availability, and trunk, growth, we were able to, we discovered that an additional 10 to 18% of the variation in trunk growth can be explained by light availability. And on Tuesday, Phil Van Mankum asked, do we need spatially explicit models? And I would argue yes. But this study is good evidence using a cone of influence to assess competition works in uneven age management scenarios. I spent a lot of time looking at the 4C models, growth models that go into 4C. I haven't spent a lot of time using them myself, so I'm really curious what managers think of the 4C growth model for uneven age management scenarios. Is it adequate? Is it good enough for our uses? Or should we try to improve upon it? Or should we think about building a separate model for uneven age redwood growth management? So big thanks to Kenneth Fisher and Save the Redwoods League and HSU for funding this project. Thanks to all the individuals that helped make it happen. And thanks to the landowners and agencies that gave me permission to work on their forests. And thank you all for coming. I'm curious what you all think.
I think I heard you say 500-year-old trees, the question is carbon about wood growth, about the same rate as 18 and a 50-year-old tree. So do I go with, was it 18 50-year-old trees or one 500-year-old tree? And I guess to answer that question, I need to know what kind of footprint is 18 trees equivalent to the footprint of one of the 500-year-old trees?
Yeah, that's definitely something that could be looked into, but I think if you stay for Bob Van Pelt's talk, it will be pretty obvious that stacking your foliage in a vertical arrangement really maximizes the productivity of a forest. So you could have that tree 21 with a bunch of tree 1s underneath it and still have the same footprint as if you just had a bunch of the small trees.
Any other questions?